بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Last time we stopped off with uh, the maqlub hadith and we went into its divisions, and now we're continuing with al-fard at line 23. He says رحمه الله والفرد ما قيده بثقة أو جمع أو قصر على رواية. So last time and even before that we mentioned a type of hadith called al-gharib, and it's a hadith in which uh, in anywhere in the chain of narration, it's limited to one person. Whether the entire chain is composed of one narrating from one, or if it's just one generation, there is one person narrating from two. Anywhere where there is a limit of one person, we call it al-gharib. And it's not a weak or strong hadith, it simply refers to the amount of people in that generation of narrators, in the sanad. Al-fard is very similar. Now, many muhaddithin, they won't make a distinction between al-fard and al-gharib. Most muhaddithin will explain it the way I explained it, in which that anywhere where there is one person in the chain, we call it gharib. Some muhaddithin like to be more specific. And if that gharib hadith is limited to a reliable narrator, so we said a gharib hadith, there has to be one narrator, it's limited to one. They say if it's limited to that one narrator and that narrator happens to be reliable, they call it al-fard. Some other muhaddithin will call a hadith gharib and they will call it fard if it's one sahabi specifically. So if it's one sahabi and then there's two tabi'een and two tabi'een, then they call it fard, because it may come off to some people that the word gharib it could come off as a little rude to use with a sahabi narrator, even though there's nothing technically wrong with it. It's just conventionally, the word gharib is conventionally used in a negative sense. And so some people will call all hadith gharib. Some of them will call it only gharib if it's unreliable and fard if it's reliable. Some people will call it gharib and only will call it fard if the singular narrator in the generation is from the generation of the Sahabi. Like this is tafarrud or gharaba. When we call gharib or fard, this is generally referring to the narrators. There is another type of a hadith called gharib or fard, and it's when it's not limited to a specific narrator. However, it could be limited to a specific city or a specific place. There are some ahadith, for example, that were only narrated by the people of Kufa. Now, the amount of people in Kufa, it's irrelevant to what we're saying. There could be 100 people in Kufa narrating the hadith, but the point is, if all the narrators happen to be living in that city, we call it fard. We say tafarrada bihi al-Kufa. The people of Kufa are singular in narrating this, or the people of Medina, or the people of Egypt. And this happens because sometimes only one or two Sahaba would have heard a certain hadith. So whichever city they happen to live in, the tabi'een and the tabi'een in that city would be singular in narrating it. Of course, until later on it was canonized and the books were widespread. But in the earlier generations, there could be some ahadith only heard in one place. There are some ahadith in which they were only narrated by people in Iraq. Now, that doesn't mean that the people of Medina or the people of Mecca would not hear about these ahadith, but they would call it singular until they hear about them. So a Sahabi in Kufi would narrate a hadith, the tabi'een in Kufa would narrate that hadith, and then eventually those tabi'een in Kufa who were singular in narrating it, eventually they would have narrated to someone in Medina. Either a Kufan visits Medina or a person from Medina visits Kufa. So it's not as if these ahadith were hidden for a long time, uh, any hadith that is narrated exclusively by a city or a region, it didn't last for long, but it's still important to know it because it could explain some of the differences of opinion that existed before they found out about them. So in the very early times, in the late Sahabi times, and in the last after the Prophet ﷺ died, uh, up till let's say the first generation or so of Tabi'een, you will find some of the fatawa of the Sahaba, the fiqh opinions of the Sahaba, you'll find some of them to be strange. Uh, and when you look at the hadith that are narrated as opposed to these fiqh opinions that we find to be strange, we get an explanation. We find out that these ahadith that oppose these specific views were not commonly narrated in the city that that specific Sahabi was living in. And it's not, naming some examples would take too long in this context. It'll be better off in a usul al-fiqh class. So we're not going to mention any examples, but this is why it's important to know if a singular city or region would have been exclusively narrating a hadith. But when we use fard or gharib, almost always it's referring to the narrators rather than the cities. But both of them exist and both of them are important. وما بعلة غموض أو خفى معلل عندهم قد عرف. So we already mentioned the hadith with a illah, a hidden defect. And we mentioned this in the first class when we defined the hadith sahih. We mentioned that from the conditions of a hadith sahih is that it does not have a illah, a hidden defect. And I mentioned a bit of examples of a illah, and I'm going to mention some more right now. So a hadith can appear to be authentic. We can look at it, its text will be acceptable. It will be narrated by a chain of narration, all of which are people who have met each other, all of which are reliable and trustworthy people. Yet it is wrong. Sometimes a reliable, no matter how relied upon he is, he can make a mistake. He can narrate from someone and confuse his name. He can narrate from someone and confuse a word. He can make a mistake. So a novice or intermediate muhaddith is going to hear this hadith, is going to say, okay, this chain of narration is acceptable. All these people have met each other. All these people are relied upon and upright people. And this text seems to be acceptable. This is what most normal muhaddithin would do. But obviously the masters of hadith who have memorized tens of thousands of asanid and tens of thousands of texts will be able to pick up on mistakes that a beginner or intermediate muhaddith will not be able to pick up on. The giants such as al-Bukhari and Muslim and Daraqutni and al-Razi and Yahya ibn Ma'in, they would spend their entire lives just memorizing the biographies of narrators and other things related to hadith. So sometimes there's a famous hadith in which one of the smaller muhaddithin, Ya'la, he narrates from I'm not going to mention the entire chain of narration, but he mentions from Abdullah ibn Umrah, whereas he should have been from I had the book open just moments ago. But basically, he narrates from a reliable narrator, whereas the truth is the narrator of that hadith was a different reliable narrator with the same name. He made a mistake with the first name and he changed it. And so when someone looks at the chain of narration, it looks like it's an acceptable chain of narration because the person he mistaked it with is also an accepted person. But the truth is the hadith is narrated by a different accepted person. So this is a hidden defect. A normal person, such as me, would not be able to, look at this chain of narration and find something wrong with it. Someone at our level And the level of anyone living today, they would look at this chain of narration, they would see the biographies of each individual person. They'll say, okay, this person met this person, this person met this person, and they're all reliable. They won't know that what is meant is actually someone else. So this is the difference between a hidden defect and a clear defect, which is the majority of what we went through in the last few lessons. We talked about all these different types of weaknesses. These are all clear defects. Someone like me or you could be able to look at a hadith and say, okay, this is a clear defect. A hidden defect is not open. That's why it's called a hidden defect. And thankfully, the muhaddithin put a lot of work into this, and many uh, many have wrote about the science of ilal. Some of the famous books include Ilal al-Tirmidhi. He has a Saghir and Kabir. He has two books on this, and there's a famous commentary on it by Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali. Another one is Ilal al-Daraqutni, which is a much longer work. I think my copy is, I think it's 10 volumes. So it's a very long work, just dedicated to finding the hidden defects of a hadith. He just lists them one after the other. So there's a lot of work that's been put into this science. It's one of the most specialized sciences in all of the hadith sciences. It's one of the hardest ones. It's one of the ones that takes the most work, the most memorization, and the most even just, from pure mental abilities. It's a very hard science. And so a lot of effort has been put into it by these imams. And so, as we mentioned, it's a condition for a sahih hadith, an authentic hadith, to not have a hidden defect. And since we have established that a hidden defect cannot be easily found by, the average person, this is why we know that the average person is incapable of, placing a hadith grading. Sometimes you will find some idiots on Twitter trying to grade the hadith themselves, using what they find on, all the biographies of muhaddithin. They're all the biographies of the narrators, these books, Lisan al-Mizan, Tarikh al-Kabir, all these books about grading hadith are all online. So they think they can just open them up and find a grading for the hadith. Whereas the truth is, while you may be able to find all the narrators and their reliability and whether they met each other, people think that's the only condition to find the authenticity of a hadith, whereas in reality, it's a much more complicated ordeal than that. And that's it for ilal. And the next type of hadith is the مضطرب. وذو اختلاف سند أو متن مضطرب عند أهيل الفم. When we say someone is مضطرب, a person is مضطرب, that means he is confused. He doesn't know. He's a contradictory person. Someone with a mental illness such as bipolar disorder, we will call him مضطرب نفسيا. We'll say he's psychologically مضطرب. A مضطرب hadith is one in which we have a few chains of narration. There's no specific number it has to reach. And they are contradictory, either in the matan or in the sanad, in the text or in the chain of narration. In the sanad or the matan, the chain of narration or the text of the hadith. And so we mentioned last time a hadith called a shadh. A shadh hadith is when we have 5 chains, we have some chains of narration that are authentic, and then we have other chains of narration which are less authentic but still authentic. And we said that the shadh, the anomalous hadith, is rejected and the stronger ones are accepted. The muttarib is similar, except in the muttarib hadith, none of them are stronger. That's the difference. In the muttarib hadith, we're unable of saying this one is stronger than the other, and so this one is shadh. In the muttarib hadith, both of them are equally strong, and so we're incapable of doing tarjih. We're incapable of saying which one is more accepted over the other. Um, one of the, and this is actually not as objective as it might seem. Some ahadith, for example, there's a famous hadith that if any of you have studied fiqh, you'll to a intermediate level which you deal with a hadith. There's a famous hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ says, إذا بلغ الماء قلتان لم يحمل الخبث. If water reaches a certain amount, it won't carry najasa. Now this hadith is rejected by the Maliki school, at least by most of them. And the reason is that this hadith has, or one of the reasons it's rejected is that this hadith has multiple chains of narration. All of them are contradictory. It's very hard to find out who narrated this hadith. There is a version in Sahih Muslim. And so the Shafi'is who accept this hadith, they will come and tell you, this isn't a muttarib hadith because we have one which is stronger than the others. Whereas the Malikis will say, no, it doesn't seem that this one is stronger than the others. It seems that that the narrators are all confused. So it's not an objective science. There's no one standard to find what is muttarib and what is not. It's a matter of ijtihad. It's not a matter of black and white. Funnily enough, that same hadith, it's also muttarib in the text, not just the sanad. So in one version of the hadith, it'll say qillatan, and a qilla is a jar. It's a almost unit of measurement that they used back then. So in the relied upon version that the Shafi'is and Hanabila use, they will say qillatan, two qillas, two jars. In another version of the hadith, it'll say qillatan aw thalatha. So two or three jars. In another version of the hadith, it'll say 40 qillas. So the text itself is not, it's also muttarib. But again, the Shafi'is will claim that the one in Sahih Muslim, which contains the text that says two qillas, they will say that's relied upon. And so the one that says 2 or 3 and the one that says 40, etc., all these are, they're rejected because this one is stronger. Whereas the Malikis will say this is muttarib and they reject all of them together because they find it, from their perspective, they find it impossible to say this one is stronger than another one. What about Hadith al-Jariyah? Does it fall under this type? Many will argue that, and I personally argue that. I wrote about this before. And obviously, we can't go into details about Hadith al-Jariyah in such a short time. But yes, Hadith al-Jariyah, you guys know the famous hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ freed a slave woman. And in some versions of the hadith, it will say, he will ask her, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he will ask her, where is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Whereas in other versions of a hadith, he will simply say, he will simply ask her, do you bear witness that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only thing worthy of worship and that I am the messenger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And so it's according to many people, this is a muttarib hadith because the text is, we have multiple chains of narration. All of them there's different texts in the hadith, and it's impossible to say which one is stronger because they're all authentic. Obviously, there's so much to be said about that hadith. Yeah, I'm not going to have a whole discussion about it. That can be its own lecture, its own 2-hour lecture about that hadith. Anyways, what do the Hanafis say, since you already mentioned the other schools about Qullatain? I don't know whether they accept or reject the hadith, but they definitely don't accept the ruling that the Shafi'is do. So yeah, the Hanafis have their third position about water, but I don't know which hadith they reject or not reject. That'll be something to ask them. But in the actual ruling, like the actual ruling to deal with, they're a little closer to the middle. They're kind of the middle ground between the Shafi'is and the Malikis. And that's what we say for muttarib. Can be in text and can be in sanad. But generally speaking, the Sahihain are generally free of muttarib ahadith. Even there are exceptions. There are people who say certain ahadith are muttarib, as the two examples we just gave, but generally they are free of such things. And the next one is al-mudraj. والمدرجات في الحديث ما أتت من بعض ألفاظ الرواة اتصلت. Sometimes a Sahabi will narrate a hadith and then he will give a comment about it. He will give a comment either about a fiqh ruling or, if he's narrating a historical event, he will give his own memory. And usually when you read this in a hadith book, they will specify and will say, قال الصحابي عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم كذا كذا كذا. Sahabi mentioned from the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم XYZ, and then the hadith narrator will go back and say the Sahabi said XYZ, so he will make a difference. Sometimes, naturally, a hadith narrator will sometimes mix these two. Sometimes the hadith narrator will forget that this comment is from the Sahabi and not from the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And they will accidentally include the words of the Sahabi in the hadith. Another way for this to happen is sometimes when it's written down, when the hadith is written down, the collector of the hadith, the author, he will have his own comment beside it. And sometimes the person who is next in transmission, he receives that text and he's reading that text, he won't know that this comment is from the collector and not from the actual hadith. And so this is what we call al-mudraj. When the hadith masters find that this comment is not from the Prophet ﷺ or from the Sahabi, it's from one of the later narrators, he will say this hadith is mudraj. And it doesn't necessarily mean we weaken the hadith. Sometimes all that is necessary for us to do is to just separate these two sayings. Sometimes we could weaken the hadith if we're incapable of knowing where the hadith ends and where it begins. But generally, that's a very rare occurrence. And again, it's not a black and white science. Sometimes, a certain mujtahid imam will say that this hadith is mudraj, whereas the other one will be certain that it is not. And so they will have a different fiqh ruling based on that difference in the hadith grading. It also depends largely on whether that mujtahid imam accepts the saying of a Sahabi as a valid evidence. Some mujtahideen will tell you that the opinion of a Sahabi is not an evidence in fiqh, and so they will be even more strict with hadith mudraja than other people will be. And so if there's even an accusation of that the hadith might be mudraj, they will be much more cautious in using it as a primary evidence. But again, just like ilal, a lot of work has been put into this. When the hadithin look at all the asanid of the same hadith beside each other, they're able to tell almost always that a hadith is mudraj or not. As opposed to the Christians, for example, who, when you look at their gospels, there's a bunch of interpolations. They have no chain of narration. They have no science of hadith. It's impossible for them to tell what is from the original gospels and what is commentary and what is not. Some of you who might be interested, you can read about something called the I don't know how English people pronounce it, the Johannine comma, which is in the Gospel of John. You'll have a verse that says there are three that bear witness in heaven, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And you look at the original text, and that's not part of the text. That's actually a personal comment that a priest put on the paper. And then later on, they just included it in the Word of God. And that's uh, the Trinity somehow became part of uh, the New Testament in that way. So yeah, this is why the entire science of Hadith exists. It's so that we make sure that stuff like this doesn't happen. And 99% of the time, we are able to know that stuff like this doesn't happen. وما روى كل قرين عن أخيه مدبج فاعرفه حقا وانتقيه. This is a less important type of hadith to know. مدبج. Uh, it's when we call a hadith mudabbaj when a narrator is narrating from someone from the same level. So, as we mentioned many times, sometimes the Sahaba would narrate from each other, and the Sahaba are from the same level. So, Abu Huraira narrates from Aisha radiallahu anha, and Aisha radiallahu anha narrates from Abu Huraira radiallahu anhu. So, they both narrate from each other, and they are in the same level. Uh, Similarly, in the Tabi'een, Umar ibn Abdul Aziz narrates from the Zuhri, and the Zuhri narrates from Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. And from the Tabi'een, uh, Malik narrates from al-Awza'i, and al-Awza'i narrates from Imam Malik. And so we call this mudabbaj when people from the same level are narrating from each other. And in the line he says min akhi, from his brother, or an akhi, from his brother. When he says his brother, he means from his peer. So it's not a brother. It means someone from the same level, either in generation or uh, in age, such as a tabi'i from a tabi'i or a sahabi from a sahabi. And they have to both narrate from each other equally. It's not just that one person narrates from another. It's not just that Malik narrates from an Awza'i. It has to be both of them. It has to be Malik narrating from an Awza'i and an Awza'i narrating it from Malik. So it has to be both-sided. Otherwise, it wouldn't be called mudabbaj. طيب. Should we continue? No, okay. Inshallah, next time we will finish the text. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines left, and the last two are not really lines, they're just conclusion. So we really have only a few more lines. Inshallah, tomorrow we will finish the al-Bayquniyya, and that will be it until the end of Ramadan, because we are nearing the last 10 nights, and I want everyone to I expect everyone to be focused on qiyam and other forms of worship, and not studying. Studying should be left until after Ramadan. And so, inshallah, when the time comes after a week or two, I will send you the specifics about what we will do next. But until then, just want everyone to focus on what I said. I'm just reading the question. The Hadith of Jibreel. So Zaid, your question is really more an usul al-fiqh question, not a hadith question. Yeah, I can't go into too much detail in a few minutes. Inshallah, if we study usul al-fiqh, I will go back to this because it is an important question. There's not enough time to address the different aspects of this. Our curriculum is level 1 Islamic studies. Well, al-Bayquniyya was level 1. After that, obviously, level 2. It'll be something higher. Maybe even Kathir. And maybe after that, al-Irshad by Nawawi, which is level 2.5. I'm not sure what your question is. There's no rigid levels. It's just prerequisites and then what comes after that. I heard from a Hanafi Hadith scholar that the Muwatta is actually more authentic than Sahih Bukhari after doing his research. Now, people say that al-Bukhari is the most authentic Hadith book uh, that exists, and this is true based off the most scrutinous Hadith standards, which is the Shafi'i standards and the ones after them. Um, so according to Maliki standards, the Muwatta is on the same level as Bukhari. But the thing is, Imam Malik includes mursal hadith. He includes hadith that have breaks in the Sahabi level. And we mentioned that the Malikis and the Hanafis, they don't see a problem with this. And even when you look at all the mursal hadith in the Muwatta, you can find them outside of the Muwatta non-mursal. So even according to Shafi'i standards, every hadith in the Muwatta is authentic, except that the asanid that Imam Malik chooses would not all be authentic according to the Shafi'is. And so that's why Sahih al-Bukhari is considered the most authentic book. It's because it's more authentic according to everyone's standards. Whereas if you look at just Maliki or Hanafi standards, then it is very easily arguable. And I find it to be the case that the Muwatta is on the same level. Another important aspect is that Imam Malik does not include a hadith that contradict each other. So if there is in one chapter, and we mentioned this in the very first class, even the preliminary class to Maliki fiqh a few months, 2-3 months ago, we mentioned that Imam Malik narrates the hadith that there is action upon. So when you read a hadith in the Muwatta, you will not find another hadith in the Muwatta that contradicts it. Whereas Imam Bukhari, he will mention 3 or 4 hadith that are contradictory, and then he will tell you, okay, this one is abrogated, this one is not abrogated, and he will give you a detailed explanation. So Imam Bukhari includes a hadith that there's nothing to act upon. Some people, such as At-Tirmidhi, he would consider abrogated hadith, mansukh hadith, to be from amongst the hadith with hidden defects. So what you're asking basically is, it really depends whose standards you're asking. To us, the Muwatta is, every hadith in it is authentic, and every hadith in it, there is something to learn upon it from a fiqh perspective. Whereas Imam Bukhari, he has a hadith that there's nothing to benefit from a fiqh perspective, because they're abrogated or they're considered weaker than something that is stronger than them. Not in chain of narration, but in action. And Imam Bukhari does include a hadith in which the wordings of the hadith are not the strongest. So an authentic hadith can be in the Muwatta and in al-Bukhari. And the wording in the Muwatta can be stronger than the wording of al-Bukhari. And actually, the very first hadith in the Muwatta actually applies to this. So you don't have to go far. If you look at the very first hadith of a Muwatta, and you look at the same wording of the hadith in Bukhari, you'll find that the wording in Bukhari has some mistakes. But you read it in Bukhari and you can still understand it. It's not as if the meaning has changed. It's just, minor words. It doesn't change the meaning. That's not the problem. So yeah, instead of answering your question shortly, I've gone off topic from multiple sides, from multiple points of view. That's what there is to be said. It really depends on who you're asking. Generally speaking, when we talk about hadith in general, in a non-madhab point of view, we kind of fold to the Shafi'is and their hadith standards and say that Bukhari is the strongest book. and that's why we say what we say. And that's all we have time for now. Jazakumullah khairan all for joining. Sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in.